Good morning. Welcome back to the Liberal Union 9/11. On December 18, 2025, Washington awoke to the peculiar stillness that only follows a consequential presidential address delivered the night before, a city suspended between reaction and recalibration as lawmakers, markets, allies, and adversaries alike parsed the implications of the president's December 17th speech. And from the first hours of the morning, the Capitol bore the unmistakable signs of strain. Federal office buildings operating on skeleton crews under the pall of an active government shutdown, security barricades lingering longer than usual, coffee shops near Capitol Hill opening late, and aides shuttling between buildings with the clipped urgency of people who know that time, optics, and momentum are suddenly inseparable. The administration moved quickly to shape the post-address narrative, announcing before sunrise a one-time $1,776 Christmas bonus check for active-duty U.S. troops and certain reserve components, a figure chosen with deliberate symbolism and rolled out as both a morale boost and a political counterweight to criticism that overseas commitments were draining domestic priorities. And in a brief on-camera appearance, White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt framed the payments as evidence of what she called an economic pivot from anxiety to stability, arguing that when inflation falls, when pay rises, and when the commander-in-chief prioritizes the men and women who serve, the affordability narrative collapses under its own weight. Language clearly designed to dovetail with fresh economic data released minutes later, showing consumer price index inflation unexpectedly dropping to 2.7%, a sharper-than-forecast decline that the administration immediately seized upon as proof that its policies were working and that what it derided as the opposition's affordability hoax was losing traction. Markets responded with cautious optimism, equities edging higher even as bond yields fluctuated. But economists warned that a single CPI print does not erase structural pressures on housing, healthcare, and energy, a nuance largely drowned out in the day's political crossfire, as Republicans split publicly over whether to embrace the inflation data or argue that families still feel squeezed regardless of top-line numbers, a rift laid bare by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who told reporters that you can't tell a mom at the grocery store that 2.7% is victory when her cart still costs more than it did 3 years ago, accusing fellow Republicans who echoed the administration's optimism of abandoning grassroots reality, a statement that highlighted a growing internal GOP divide between data-driven reassurance and populist skepticism. Yet even as domestic economics dominated the morning shows, the global dimension of the president's agenda asserted itself with force as confirmation emerged of a massive $10 billion U.S. arms sale to Taiwan, including advanced air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and intelligence support packages, a move that immediately escalated tensions with Beijing, which responded with sharply worded condemnations, military drills near the Taiwan Strait, and warnings of grave consequences, while administration officials defended the sale as a stabilizing measure consistent with long-standing commitments, insisting it was defensive in nature and necessary to deter unilateral changes to the status quo, though critics cautioned that the timing, coming amid heightened global volatility and a Caribbean naval standoff, risked overextension and miscalculation. That standoff, the Venezuelan naval blockade announced the day before, continued to reverberate across the hemisphere, with U.S. Navy task groups maintaining a visible Armada presence in Caribbean waters, destroyers and support vessels rotating patrols under strict rules of engagement as commercial shipping rerouted and insurance rates spiked. And while the administration described the operation as precise and enforceable, regional governments expressed unease about escalation, humanitarian impact, and the precedent of maritime containment, concerns amplified by reports from energy analysts that even limited disruptions were already affecting fuel availability in parts of Central America, a reminder that economic pressure radiates outward in unpredictable ways. Inside Washington, these international developments collided with domestic political paralysis as the government shutdown entered another uncertain day. Furloughed workers voicing frustration outside agency headquarters, while negotiators traded blame behind closed doors. The shutdown's symbolism sharpening every policy debate as lawmakers argued over priorities, even as the administration pressed forward with announcements that assumed executive capacity. A contrast not lost on critics who questioned how new spending commitments could be squared with a shuttered government. Among those commitments was the sprawling $901 billion National Defense Authorization Act, which cleared its final procedural hurdles and headed to the president's desk, carrying a 3.8% troop pay raise, expanded procurement authorities, and explicit language pushing back against proposed troop withdrawals from Europe, a bipartisan rebuke reflecting deep congressional anxiety about signaling weakness to Russia amid ongoing instability. And though the administration welcomed the pay raise and much of the bill's framework, senior officials privately acknowledged frustration with constraints on flexibility, a tension emblematic of the broader civil-military debate unfolding in real time. Layered atop this was fresh data from the Department of Homeland Security, confirming that approximately 2.5 million migrants had exited, transited, or interacted with U.S. border systems over the past year, a figure that took on a more volatile edge amid reports circulating online and in some local outlets of masked federal agents operating in American cities as part of coordinated enforcement actions, claims that DHS officials neither fully confirmed nor outright dismissed, instead emphasizing operational security and the safety of personnel, a response that did little to quell speculation and which civil liberties groups seized upon to demand transparency, while supporters argued that anonymity was necessary in a climate of rising threats. The administration sought to contextualize the migrant data by linking it to regional instability exacerbated by economic collapse and authoritarian governance, including in Venezuela, a narrative positioning the blockade not as an isolated act, but as part of a broader strategy to stem destabilizing flows. Yet critics countered that enforcement-heavy approaches historically increase displacement in the short term, a point underscored by humanitarian organizations warning of bottlenecks and vulnerability across transit routes. Throughout the day, Carolyn Levitt returned repeatedly to the inflation figures as an anchor point, telling one interviewer that 2.7% CPI isn't just a number, it's breathing room, and breathing room allows us to invest in security, in service members, and in stability abroad without bankrupting families at home, a line that encapsulated the administration's attempt to bind economic credibility to foreign policy assertiveness. While Marjorie Taylor Greene, in contrast, used the same data to argue that Washington was disconnected from lived experience, warning that paper victories don't pay rent, and suggesting the GOP risked alienating its base if it celebrated statistics over sentiment. As evening approached, the sense of a nation absorbing shockwaves became more palpable, global markets reacting nervously to simultaneous signals of tightening and stimulus, allies weighing reassurance against restraint, and adversaries probing for resolve, while in the Caribbean, the U.S. naval presence remained steady, crews operating under orders that emphasized vigilance without provocation, and in Washington, the shutdown light stayed dark in many buildings, even as televised debates burned bright, underscoring a paradox at the heart of the moment, that the machinery of state can project power abroad, even as it stalls at home. By nightfall, the narrative of December 18, 2025, had crystallized not as a single story, but as a dense braid of economics, security, politics, and perception, a day defined by the immediate aftermath of a presidential address that sought to impose coherence on complexity, offering troop bonuses as tangible reassurance, touting falling inflation as vindication, advancing arms sales as deterrence, and enforcing a blockade as leverage, all while navigating a fractured Congress, an uneasy electorate, and a volatile international environment. And as analysts signed off and the capital settled into another cold night under shutdown conditions, the unanswered questions loomed larger than the talking points about whether inflation relief would be felt broadly enough to matter politically, whether the arms sale to Taiwan would deter or provoke, whether the Caribbean blockade would contain or inflame, whether migration pressures would ease or intensify, and whether the fragile unity glimpsed in defense legislation could survive the deeper rifts over affordability, authority, and America's role in a world that seems increasingly resistant to neat narratives, leaving December 18, 2025, not as a moment of resolution, but as a hinge in a story still very much in motion.